Hi everyone. My name is Matteo, and I'm going to talk about a game that I co-designed, which is over there called Daybreak. But before I do that, I would like to start with some audience participation. So please raise your hands if you've played this game before. Have you played this game before? Raise your hands if you have. It's not chess. It's not chess. What is it? I think you know it. Yes. There you go. So the game played you indeed. Yeah, so that's capitalism. And capitalism is a game that we all play, whether we like it or not, or a game that plays us. Or to use another kind of metaphor, is the water that we swim in. So we're so immersed in it that we often forget that it exists. And does this work? Okay, so the idea that capitalism is not only the only possible economic system, but also that is the reality that shapes us, has been termed capitalist realism. So, in other words, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. That's what capitalist realism is about. It's shaping everything that we do, shaping the boundaries of what we think of as possible, as realistic, as plausible, and even desirable. So if it shapes everything, it also means that it shapes how we understand and how we make games. So in capitalism, games are entertainment commodities mostly. So we play them, we buy them, and we play them for fun, which means that often they have abstract or fictional themes. But games can also be used to critique real world systems. And this is not a new idea, it's been done for a while. So, hands up if you've played this game. Okay, better. And probably, given that you're an audience of game scholars or people interested in games, you know that I'm talking about the Landlord's game, the game that was designed not as a game, but actually as a political campaign tool. So, this lady, Elizabeth McGee, was a campaigner for a tax reform. And what she wanted to do is to persuade people about both the problems of capitalism or land grabbing, as you were saying, as well as showing alternative systems to it. So pushing against capitalist realism before it was actually called capitalist realism. And what she did was design a game called the Landlord's game, and it was designed into two different sets of rules that could be played on the same board. So the competitive rule set, which was called Monopolist, and plays just like the Monopoly that you all played and hopefully disliked, is the one where you are holding properties, charging rent, and then trying to bankrupt your opponents or your family. And this is how every game of the Landlord's game would start. But at any point during the game, you could actually switch by majority to the other version, which was called Prosperity. And that was a cooperative rule set. So Monopolist, the competitive rule set, was about the problem. Prosperity was about the solution. And in Prosperity, instead of paying rent to the landlord, you would pay tax to a treasury, and then the treasury will start buying up properties, services like schools, like railways, like hospitals, and then redistribute the rest to everyone else. So the idea was to show how a more redistributive system could work and model the policy that McGee was campaigning for. And then 30 years later, that game was plagiarized into Monopoly and the cooperative rules were scrapped. So I find that interesting because what she identified as the problem then was reframed in Monopoly as the goal, as the capitalist fantasy of becoming the monopolist. And so, like in Monopoly, not all, but most games foster this kind of zero-sum competition where I win if you lose. But cooperative games instead allow us to work together to share a goal, to actually compete against the game itself, and therefore we allow us to codify a systemic problem in the game itself. So an example of that is a pandemic. It's a problem that we all share and that we all have to solve. Hands up if you play Pandemic. Okay, great. Normally it's like 2 or 3 people that play Pandemic. So Pandemic, for those of you who don't know, it's a game that was published in 2008 and popularized the genre of cooperative games. So you work as a team of specialists hopping around the world to try and contain outbreaks that are happening all over the world in those cities. And while you do that, you also collect information that will eventually help you find a cure for the viruses. Sounds easy. You're all on the same team, but it's actually not. It's very hard to win because you have this relentless virus or 4 viruses that are spreading up, and that could lead to a collapse of your society. So when an actual pandemic happened in 2020, I wrote a blog post about what we could learn from the game applied to COVID, and then I discovered that the author of Pandemic, Matt Leacock, had written something along those lines on the New York Times. So I reached out to him on what was then known as Twitter, and I didn't know him back then, but we started a conversation about Pandemic, about cooperative games, and also about the climate crisis, because he was also thinking about making a cooperative game about the climate crisis. So that conversation started on Twitter, and then we moved on to Zoom, and that became a weekly conversation, and it turned into a project, and then 3 years later we published the game. So I want to tell you a little bit about the design process and the design principles in particular that are underpinning the game, that kept on anchoring us back to what we wanted to do in that quite tortuous process, which is designing and developing a game. So it can be boiled down into 3 words, and I'll go through each of them. So the first thing is we agreed that we passed the point of raising awareness about climate change or debating whether climate change is real or not. But instead, we wanted players to focus on solutions, on what has to be done, and to really face that question constantly. Especially because games, as we've heard yesterday, and we know, are the art of agency. So they're about people doing stuff, solving problems. And what big problem is there out there to solve? It's the climate crisis. And we also agreed that we wanted to frame that as a global systemic problem rather than something that you could address at an individual consumerist level, because we find it quite frustrating when climate action is framed as a matter of individual lifestyle choices. So eating less meat, flying less, maybe having no kids. They are all transformative actions at an individual level, but they're not enough to match the scale and the urgency of the climate crisis. And also, you may know that the personal carbon footprint is an idea that was popularized by a company called British Petroleum, BP. So the idea of getting you to obsess about your own individual consumption choices to distract from the 70+% of global emissions that the oil industry is responsible for or facilitating. So bringing that back to what is the problem at a global level and how can we show players and get them involved with trying out systemic solutions. And that helped us also answer the question of who are the players. So in Daybreak, you play as a state because they are the entities capable of taking the kind of scale of the challenge and also taking the risks that private capitalist organizations typically won't take. So in Daybreak, you can play as the US, as China, Europe, or the majority world. And I'll go through each of them and explain a bit why we chose them. So the US is what we wanted to do was to create to encompass as much of the world as possible in a way that felt realistic. So the US is a hyper-capitalist state, and I mean that because it's not only a capitalist state, but also one that is very much trying to impose capitalism on the rest of the world. And historically is the biggest polluter in terms of carbon emissions, as well as more recently the biggest exporter of fossil fuels. So not quite the climate hero, but certainly a state that has power to make a difference when it comes to systemic climate action. Then we've got China, which is mostly a socialist state that participates in the capitalist economy, is the factory of the world, and currently the biggest polluter, the biggest emitter of carbon emissions, but also, interesting tension and contradiction, it's the state that is producing and exporting more clean energy technology than the rest of the world combined. So again, it can be a big player in this global challenge. Then we've got Europe, which is the birthplace of capitalism, and it's not a country, but a coalition of countries that tend to work together and have similar historical trajectories. And then the majority world, which we initially called the Global South, again, not a country, but a group of countries that tend to work together when it comes to climate negotiations as the G77. And the countries or the states that are at the forefront of climate, the effects of the climate crisis. So they are feeling the worst effects of the climate crisis, and historically have the least responsibilities for it. So, and again, an interesting tension to play with there. So you're in charge of a state, and your starting political economy is based on current emissions, which we simplified, of course, and for to be able to manipulate them in a game. And that leads to the second principle, which is realism. So we try to be realistic on two levels. Realism both in terms of the problems that you face while you play the game. So the emissions that you have to reduce are based on current emissions, and the crises that you face are based on stuff that's already happening. And realism also on the solutions front. So the type of policies that you can experiment with in the game are based on actual policies and existing technologies, not science fiction. So what that means, this is a small sample of the type of crisis that you can see, that you can experience in the game, is that the game will trigger a series of crises, and these span from what you typically associate with the climate crisis, or extreme weather events like floods or droughts or hurricanes, all the way down to the effects that are on society, on economy, and on politics. So you can see, for instance, ecofascism is one on the rise. It's one of the crises that you could experience while playing Daybreak. Capital strikes and the erosion of democracy. So this set of crises that can be leading to the collapse of society. And also, one that I like to point out on the bottom left there, you might not be able to see it, but it's called fossil fuel sabotage. And it's the idea of the destruction, the violent destruction of private property, which is kind of like the ultimate sin in capitalism. And it's framed as a crisis because players are representing states. So the policies that they can play out are legal stuff. But at the same time, something like industrial sabotage can become an opportunity as well. And if you get to play Daybreak, you'll see how that plays out. So in terms of solutions, the things that you can try out are both what people call mitigation, so reducing emissions by building clean energy and by decarbonizing all aspects of your economies, and what climate folks call adaptation, so building resilience in your society, in your ecosystems, in your infrastructure. And you can also try out some solutions that are quite controversial, like nuclear power, for instance, or geoengineering. You may see that the project over there called stratospheric sulfur. That's the idea of spraying the atmosphere with gas that would lower the temperature of global temperatures artificially. But it's a speculative technology at this point, but it's one that is being considered because it fits the capitalist realism idea of something that would allow us to continue burning fossil fuels while artificially lowering the temperatures. And who cares about the consequences in the global south? So all of this is realistic, but there are a couple of assumptions that the game makes which are more utopian than realistic. And the first one is that states are taking the climate crisis seriously. And second is that states are cooperating to address it. So we are aware that this is not realistic, but we still decided to go ahead with this combination of a realistic model and a utopian frame, or a utopian couple of assumptions, to create what we were then told you can call possitopia. So a possitopian space for people to explore what is possible. And this is because climate change has been so marginal to the political debate that even imagining what can possibly happen when you have a coalition of interests that have taken power and that are dealing with the practical problems of solving this huge, complex challenge is something valuable. And the way that this works, so it's cooperative not because you're forced to work together, but because you can lose altogether. So as the game progresses, that red line, if you can see, so on the x-axis you have time that passes, and on the y-axis you have emissions that grow, that cause warming, and that warming causes crisis, and those keep on becoming more frequent and more intense. So you lose if it gets too hot, if it gets too late, or more likely if your communities are overwhelmed by those crises. And so you have a societal collapse as the binding lose condition. And then the win condition is when you can flatten that emission curve. So if you roll out policies that allow you to stop emissions from growing at a global level and you reach net zero, then you reach that milestone. That's when the game ends. Now, of course, in the real world, that wouldn't be the end, but it's a very important moment that signifies the start of something new. And so what the game does conceptually is allow you to play within that space where the red line, if you like, is dystopia, is what happens if you do nothing and you allow business as usual to continue. And the green line is not quite utopia, but is post-utopia. So it's the idea that on the one hand, you have a cautionary tale about what could happen. And it does happen often that when you play Daybreak, the first time especially, you're more likely to lose the game and to see the unraveling of society in front of you and the other players. But on the other hand, it creates this idea that you can win, and winning doesn't mean a perfect world. It's a world that is going to be transformed by the climate crisis, scarred. You see loss, you see damage, but at the same time, you also see what is possible. And at the end of that journey, you'll have seen a world transformed and possibly a post-capitalist world. So to kind of circle back to capitalist realism, the point of this game is to create a space where people can have a detailed, an active, a radical, and shared imagination, which potentially can be an antidote to capitalist realism. And on that note, I will leave you with with this link. So if you want to learn more about Daybreak and the design thinking behind it, that's our blog.